When we look back at the 20th century, one question continues to echo through classrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms around the world. How does society allow someone like Adolf Hitler to rise to absolute power? It's a question that makes us uncomfortable, and it should. Because the answer isn't about one person's evil genius or a nation's unique moral failure. The answer is about systems, circumstances, and choices that any society might face when the right pressures align. Today we're going to walk through the historical conditions that made Hitler's rise possible. This isn't a story about inevitability or destiny. It's a story about how economic desperation, political fragmentation, institutional weakness, and mass psychology can converge to create openings that shouldn't exist in healthy democracies. Understanding this history helps us recognize warning signs in any era, in any country, including our own. If you're interested in history that asks difficult questions and explores how societies change over time, please consider subscribing to Global Past. We focus on the forces behind historical events, not just the events themselves. Now, let's begin. Germany in 1918 was a nation in shock. The First World War had ended and the German Empire had collapsed. For 4 years, the country had mobilized every resource it had. Convinced that victory was within reach, millions of young men had been sent to the front. Families had endured shortages of food and fuel. The government had promised that sacrifice would lead to triumph. And then, suddenly, it was over. The Kaiser abdicated. The military leadership stepped back, and the politicians who remained were left to sign an armistice that felt, to many Germans, like betrayal. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. It lost significant territory, including industrial regions that had powered its economy. The military was reduced to a fraction of its former size, and most devastatingly, the country was required to pay reparations that amounted to billions of dollars, a sum so large that economists at the time questioned whether it could ever be paid. For a population already exhausted and humiliated, the treaty felt like a punishment designed to ensure Germany would never recover. Economic collapse followed quickly. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the value of the German mark. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Lifetime savings evaporated overnight. The middle class, which had been the backbone of stability and civic life, found itself impoverished. Workers who had believed in the dignity of labor now stood in endless unemployment lines. The social contract between citizens and their government was breaking down, and with it, faith in democratic institutions. Into this chaos stepped a variety of political movements, each offering a different vision of Germany's future. Communists on the left called for revolution and alignment with Soviet Russia. Social Democrats tried to hold the center and preserve the fragile Weimar Republic. Conservatives and nationalists longed for a return to order and traditional hierarchy. And on the far right, a collection of extremist groups began to gain traction by blaming Germany's suffering on external enemies and internal traitors. One of those groups was the German Workers' Party, a small nationalist organization that Adolf Hitler joined in 1919. Hitler had served in the German army during the war, and like many veterans, he struggled to adapt to civilian life in a defeated country. He was bitter, directionless, and convinced that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians, communists, and Jews. His early speeches were filled with rage, but they were also effective. He had a talent for reading a room, for channeling collective anger into simple, emotionally resonant messages. By 1921, Hitler had taken control of the party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. The name itself was strategic, designed to appeal to both nationalists and workers. The party's platform mixed extreme nationalism with vague promises of economic reform. It blamed Jews, communists, and foreign powers for Germany's problems. It called for the overthrow of the Weimar Republic and the creation of a strong, authoritarian state. But in the early 1920s, the Nazi Party was still marginal, one of many fringe movements shouting for attention. Everything changed with the Great Depression. When the American stock market crashed in 1929, the economic shockwave rippled across the globe. Germany, which had been stabilizing through loans from the United States, was hit especially hard. Unemployment soared. Businesses collapsed. Banks failed. The Weimar government, already struggling to maintain legitimacy, seemed powerless to stop the crisis. And in that desperation, millions of Germans began to question whether democracy itself was the problem. The Nazi Party offered something different. It didn't offer complex policy debates or incremental reform. It offered certainty. It offered scapegoats. It offered the promise of national rebirth through strength and unity. Hitler's speeches tapped into deep wells of fear and humiliation. He told audiences that they were victims of forces beyond their control, but that those forces could be defeated if Germans united behind a strong leader. He promised jobs, order, and dignity. He promised to make Germany powerful again, but Hitler didn't win power through a majority vote. In the 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest party in the Reichstag, but it still didn't have a majority. Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, not because the German people demanded it, but because conservative politicians believed they could control him. They thought they could use his popularity to stabilize the government while keeping him on a leash. They were catastrophically wrong. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to dismantle democratic institutions. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext to suspend civil liberties and arrest political opponents. The Enabling Act, passed in March, gave Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Piece by piece, the legal framework of democracy was dismantled. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, the press was brought under state control, and by the summer of 1934, after the purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had eliminated rivals within his own party and consolidated absolute power. What's crucial to understand is that this process relied on more than just Hitler's ambition. It relied on the cooperation, or at least the passivity, of millions of people. Judges enforced laws they knew were unjust. Police arrested people who had committed no crime. Business leaders made deals with the regime. Citizens informed on their neighbors. This wasn't a sudden takeover by force alone. It was a gradual process in which fear, opportunism, and moral compromise became normalized. Propaganda played a central role in this transformation. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, understood that controlling information meant controlling perception. The regime used radio, film, newspapers, and mass rallies to saturate German society with its messages. These messages were simple, repetitive, and emotionally charged. They presented Hitler as a savior. They portrayed Jews, communists, and other targeted groups as existential threats. They celebrated strength, unity, and obedience, and they created a sense of belonging for those who accepted the ideology, while isolating those who didn't. The effectiveness of Nazi propaganda wasn't just about lies. It was about creating a worldview that felt coherent and emotionally satisfying. For people who had experienced economic ruin, national humiliation, and political chaos, the Nazi narrative offered clarity. It explained suffering. It identified enemies. It promised restoration. And it demanded loyalty, not reflection. In an environment where independent media had been crushed and dissent was dangerous, many people accepted the narrative because it was the only one they heard. Education and culture were reshaped to serve the regime. Schools taught children that their highest duty was to the state and the Führer. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize racial hierarchy and national destiny. Youth organizations like the Hitler Youth trained young people to be loyal followers and future soldiers. Universities purged Jewish and dissenting professors. Artists and writers who didn't conform were silenced or driven into exile. The regime understood that controlling the present meant controlling how people thought about the past and imagined the future. By the late 1930s, Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. Political opposition had been eliminated. The legal system served the regime's goals. The economy was mobilized for rearmament, and the persecution of Jews and other targeted groups was accelerating, moving from discrimination to violence to systematic murder. The world was watching, but many democracies were reluctant to intervene, hoping that appeasement might preserve peace. That hope was shattered when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, triggering the Second World War. The war revealed the full horror of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of others deemed undesirable, stands as one of history's greatest crimes. The war itself claimed tens of millions of lives across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Cities were destroyed, entire populations were displaced, and when it finally ended in 1945, the world was left to reckon with how such atrocities had been allowed to happen. It's tempting to see Hitler's rise as an aberration, a product of unique circumstances that could never be repeated, but historians and political scientists have spent decades studying this period precisely because the conditions that enabled it aren't unique. Economic crisis, political polarization, institutional weakness, scapegoating, propaganda, and the erosion of democratic norms are patterns that appear across different times and places. Understanding how they unfolded in Germany helps us recognize them elsewhere. One of the most important lessons is the fragility of democratic institutions. Democracy doesn't sustain itself. It requires active participation, informed citizens, independent media, and leaders who respect the rule of law. When institutions are weakened by crisis, cynicism, or corruption, openings emerge for authoritarianism. The Weimar Republic failed not just because of external pressures, but because too many people within Germany lost faith in democratic processes and became willing to accept authoritarian solutions. Another lesson is the power of propaganda and the danger of unchecked media control. When a single narrative dominates and dissent is punished, societies lose the ability to self-correct. Critical thinking becomes dangerous. Moral reasoning becomes subservient to ideology, and ordinary people can be led to accept or even participate in acts they would have once found unthinkable. This is why protecting free speech, independent journalism, and diverse perspectives is essential to preventing authoritarianism. The role of complicity and moral compromise is also critical. Hitler didn't act alone. He had millions of enablers, collaborators, and passive bystanders. Some were true believers. Some were opportunists. Some were simply afraid, but the cumulative effect of their choices allowed the regime to function. This raises uncomfortable questions about individual responsibility in unjust systems. When do we speak up? When do we resist? At what point does silence become complicity? We also need to understand the appeal of simple answers to complex problems. In times of crisis, people crave certainty and clarity. Demagogues exploit this by offering narratives that are emotionally satisfying but intellectually dishonest. They identify scapegoats, promise easy solutions, and present themselves as uniquely capable of restoring order and greatness. Recognizing these patterns helps us resist them, but it requires a commitment to nuance, humility, and critical thinking even when those things are uncomfortable. Finally, this history reminds us that atrocities don't happen overnight. They happen through gradual steps, each one justified by the previous one. Rights are stripped away incrementally, violence escalates slowly, and by the time the full horror becomes clear, the mechanisms of resistance have often been dismantled. This is why vigilance matters at every stage, not just when the danger is obvious. Small erosions of norms and rights can accumulate into catastrophic outcomes if left unchecked. The story of Hitler's rise isn't just about Germany in the 1930s. It's about the vulnerabilities inherent in any political system. It's about how fear, desperation, and tribalism can override reason and compassion. It's about the consequences of institutional failure and the dangers of concentrating power. And it's about the responsibility each generation has to protect the values and structures that prevent tyranny. As we close, I want to invite you to reflect on what you've learned today. What aspects of this history stood out to you? What parallels, if any, do you see in other historical periods? And what do you think are the most important safeguards against authoritarianism in any society? Share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations help us all learn from history together. If you found this video valuable, please consider sharing it with friends, students, or anyone interested in understanding how political systems evolve and sometimes fail. History isn't just about the past. It's about equipping ourselves to recognize patterns and make better choices in the present. Thank you for watching Global Past. We believe that understanding history means grappling with hard questions and uncomfortable truths. It means looking at systems, not just individuals. And it means recognizing that the lessons of the past are never fully behind us. They're always present, waiting to be learned or repeated. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions.